Well, why don't we get started? Hey, everyone. Welcome to the thesis defense for Annabelle Stanley. I was just thinking back to a cold November day when I got this email out of the blue from this student, and later up I followed up with a phone call with her. She had just had an inquiry about starting graduate school. This is back in late 2020, I think, and I first I thought she was calling from England, but no, she just talks funny, and she uh, she also you know mentioned that she was interested in the field of structured decision making, and she'd been getting guidance from uh, one of her advisors at Cornell, Evan Cooch, and then my spider senses really started tingling, um, but we had a very good phone call, and boy, am I glad that she kind of found me and came to our lab and brightened things up. She's been an extraordinary student working on an extraordinary project for that's highly advanced at the master's level. So. Um, I'm here to introduce Annabelle and wish her good luck in her presentation and defense. And James Martin is her co-advisor, so I'm going to hand it to James to finish off the introduction.
Thanks, Clint. Yeah, I echo all of that. And where I came in is Annabelle and Clint needed some problems to work on, and I said, "Well, I've got plenty of problems." So that's where my role began in this process. And Annabelle was funded through a Warnell assistantship, so that really allowed us to be creative in her project. We weren't necessarily constrained by a contract per se, and she embraced that role. A quick story or important point is she basically had this thesis done back in the summer, a lot of the work done, but there just was one little glitch in the code, and she couldn't figure out what was going on, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And it came down to one function in several thousands lines of code, and she wasn't willing to give up on that, and really cost her a semester. But that's really an indication of what she's like as a student, as a person. Is she wasn't going to let that little bit of code defeat her, and she stuck it out, and it made a lot of difference in the results. And so personal or public service announcement number 2 is the parallel functions if you're running things on the supercomputer could cause some problems. So FYI to those that might use that function. So anyway, without further ado, we'll let Annabelle take off on this journey of her thesis defense. We'll have questions at the end. If you can, make sure you're muted and your video off. And Annabelle, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Clint and James, for the introduction. Let me go ahead and start a timer over here. Switch my pointer. All right. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And thanks, Clint and James, for the nice introductions. So Clint and James are my co-advisors, and then Doctors Jeffrey Heppenstall-Zimmerman and Kelly Robinson are on my committee. And today I'll be presenting my master's research, Making Enrollment Decisions for Private Lands Conservation Through Spatial Complexity, a case study on the Northern Bobwhite. All right, my slide won't change in laser pointer functions, so I'm going to have to switch back to that later on. But I'd like to start by talking about some fairly recent news. In June of this past spring, there was a big announcement that $500 million are coming from the Farm Bill to be put towards conservation that supports wildlife. And so this is really exciting stuff. That's a huge amount of money going towards conservation. And much of the way it's going to be applied for conservation and wildlife is going to be through conservation-centered programs, which is what my research is focusing on. And so if we're following that $500 million, it's coming from the Farm Bill, mainly through the US Department of Agriculture. And the US Department of Agriculture is this big agency that has different sub-agencies. I guess it's technically a department, and then has agencies within it, such as NRCS, or the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Farm Service Agency, FSA. And so you have this big pot of federal money that's distributed through different agencies inside the department towards specific programs, such as Working Lands Wildlife, which is under NRCS, and the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, which is under the FSA. So you've got this kind of money trickling down from this federal agency or department, and it's going towards these programs, but the programs are based at a state level. And so you have state offices for NRCS and Working Lands Wildlife. So the $500 million is actually being split up among the states. Each state's getting a certain proportion. And at the state level, these federal offices are working with the state wildlife agencies. So in Georgia, that's the Department of Natural Resources. And so there is this partnership between the federal and state level for this massive amount of federal dollars that's going to be coming into the system. There is also kind of state individual pockets, obviously to a lesser amount than $500 million. So for example, Georgia Department of Natural Resources has its own conservation incentive program. There's one particularly targeting bobwhites, which is the Bobwhite Quail Initiative. And these programs will target a whole range of species, including the golden-winged warbler and the gopher tortoise. So some of you in the South might be familiar with those species. And so moving on to what conservation incentive programs are actually doing, well, this is a way for dollars to be put into private lands to benefit conservation, mainly through different types of financial incentive programs, such as cost sharing or grants. And so you have these private landowners that have different types of habitat on their land that can be pretty rare. So for example, grassland bird species have highly fragmented habitat. Much of it is found on private lands. And so if you want to do things to benefit grassland bird species, you need to find a way to incentivize private landowners to do conservation on their property to benefit these species. And one example of a declining grassland bird is the Northern Bobwhite. The Northern Bobwhite has declined by 2/3 since 1980. It's a grassland bird. And it's unique in that it has conservation incentive programs specifically for it. So from some of those previous programs I was talking about, there's the Georgia Bobwhite Quail Initiative, which is at a state level. And there are also different federal programs targeting it, such as the CP33 practice from the Conservation Reserve Program. And then it's also Working Lands Wildlife target species. And so the Northern Bobwhite is unique. It's got these different programs that are targeting it. It's also got a lot of research that's been done on its annual cycle, which can be used to provide parameter estimates over the course of a year. So the coveys start overwintering. Coveys is basically a way of saying flocks. It's a specific term for the Northern Bobwhite, but you may be more familiar with the term flocks for describing groups of birds. So they start in these groups over winter, and then they break up into breeding pairs in the spring. You have 1 to 3 different nesting attempts over the course of the summer before they reform into those coveys in the late fall to overwinter again. And so thinking about conservation incentive programs, broadly for bobwhites as well as for other species, you have decisions you have to make as an agency managing these programs. And so in this example, we have 6 different private landowners, 2 of which are not eligible for enrollment, so they've been grayed out. We're only considering forestry land use system here. And so, okay, you've got 4 different landowners to choose between. Obviously, in a real program, this number will be scaling up significantly. But you can't pick all 4 because you've got a budgetary constraint. And so you have to take other considerations into account to make your decision here about which ones to actually enroll in your program. And so there are different conservation practices that can be applied on the landscape, including thinning and burning. And so there are different costs associated with these, which also have budgetary implications. But then again, based on your target species, you might think that certain conservation practices are better for one species than another. And so depending what species you're targeting, you may end up selecting based on conservation practices. And so this is what my research is really looking at. It's looking at these decisions that you're making inside conservation incentive programs. And so my first chapter was looking at decision-making frameworks being used in state management of quail programs. and also thinking about how structured decision-making is interacting with the conservation incentive programs. But I'll be really focusing on my second chapter here, which is to build this model-based framework to simulate private landowner incentive programs and come up with a different system of enrolling different private landowners into this program and comparing that to the status quo that is this kind of ranking and scoring framework, which I'll talk about in more detail later on. So I'd like to talk first about the PROAC cycle, which if you are familiar with structured decision making, or I've spoken to you about it, hopefully you might have the gist of it. But if not, the PROAC cycle stands for P, the problem. What problem are you actually addressing here? O, objectives. These are the values that are informing your decision. A is alternatives, typically the different sets of actions you can use to address that problem that you're choosing between. C, consequences. This is a way to actually address those, to assess those different alternatives. And then T is for trade-offs and optimization, which will allow you to pick between your alternatives based on how they perform in the consequences, with taking into account things like competing objectives. And then hopefully that will lead you to a decision that you can then take and apply. And so if we put this in the framework of a conservation incentive program, our problem is which combination of landowners should be enrolled in the conservation incentive program. Our objective here, for my problem at least, is to maximize the Northern Bobwhite abundance. So we're taking into account all the different combination of landowners that have submitted applications to the incentive program. And just to touch on this for a minute, the number of combination of landowners is really dependent on how many different, the number of different alternatives is dependent on how many landowners you start with. And so if you have 10 landowners, you have 2 raised to the power of 10 different possible combinations to pick between. So as the number of landowners increases, the number of different alternatives is almost exponentially increasing. So C, consequences, is modeling the system. There are different ways to do this. For our objective to maximize Northern Bobwhite abundance, the most straightforward way to do this would be to use a population model, which will inform the actual abundance for each of these different alternatives. There's a ranking and scoring system that can be used, which kind of intertwines your objectives with your consequences. And so you're including information about your objectives and trying to give them point values according to how you think this implicit model of the system is working. So I'll be talking more about the ranking and scoring approach later. And then finally, the trade-offs and optimization piece. So this is a comparison of which alternatives are scoring best. And a really straightforward way to do this is to use heuristic optimization, which allows you to explore a whole bunch of different alternatives and a whole bunch of different possible solutions to see which one's performing best based on that abundance objective. So you're really seeing which combination of private landowners will have give me the largest abundance of bobwhites in this landscape. And so I just want to pull out these two kind of competing frameworks or competing ways of making this decision, the ranking and scoring system and the heuristic optimization system. And so this is what I'm doing for my second chapter, is I'm comparing these different frameworks. So we start with just a random, what happens if you don't use a decision-making framework at all, as a way to kind of have a baseline assessment of what happens if we use no decision-making frameworks to address this problem. And then we're also comparing the ranking and scoring approach, which I'll be referring to as the ranking framework, or the model-based framework, which is using this optimization inside of it. So these are the 3 different frameworks we're trying to compare. And so just to go over how this problem is set up, conceptually, well, we start with the different private landowners across the landscape, identifying those different private landowner boundaries. We then identify the different forestry stands across the landscape. We make those forestry stands specific to the private landowner boundaries, and so using boundaries that aren't actually on a natural system, but are on different property maps that will be informing our decision to cut up those forestry stands and make them unique to different private landowners. We then identify the different conservation practices that can be applied to the different forestry stands. And we're making a couple of assumptions here. So we're assuming that by applying those conservation practices, we're increasing the habitat quality, which in turn increases the bobwhite abundance. And another thing that we're doing in the simulation is to use a bunch of different constraints. So in lieu of a budgetary constraint, we're using a landscape percent of enrollment cap which basically is saying there's different amounts of the landscape we can enroll under these 5 different simulations. We have a cap at 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, and 25%. And so this is just recognizing the fact that we didn't have budgetary information, but we wanted to include a constraint that wouldn't allow us to enroll all the private landowners in a conservation program, which is trying to use parameters to the system. And so just to give a brief overview of what this looks like in our simulation, I'm going to walk through this overview and then go through these one by one. So we're starting out by identifying the study area across the landscape and taking different samples from that landscape. We're then going to use the different data sources and identify what those data sources were and what modifications were made to them. Before 3 is arriving at the different forestry private landowner stands. We're then in 4 going to distribute the conservation practices across the landscape, again specific to the unique private landowner forestry stands. And 5, we're going to identify what our baseline habitat quality is. 6 is where those 3 different decision frameworks come into play, and we're actually going to make decisions about which private landowners to enroll across the landscape. Before in 7, using our population model to identify the actual abundance of birds that's coming off of the landscape from these 3 different frameworks. And so starting out with our study area and sample landscapes, our focal area here that we've identified is really just coming from the Georgia Bobwhite Quail Initiative. So this was a focal area that was previously identified for a conservation center program targeting bobwhites. So we take this area, it's about over 100, over 1 million hectares. And that's too big of an area for us to actually do some simulation on. So we take it and we just divide it up into different grid sections. And then from this, we're sampling 20 different sample landscapes. We have a small grid and a large grid, so there's 2 different sizes of landscapes here. And so we're just taking 20 different samples from each of these. And just to touch on this briefly, the number of private landowners is going to be proportional to that size of the landscape. And so the bigger the landscape is, the more different private landowners that are going to be coming into play in our decision frameworks. So there is an implication for landscape size that I'll be addressing later on. But first of all, we had to identify those private landowners. And so we're using tax information from a county tax assessor's office to identify these property boundaries. We're removing the different water bodies from these properties, as well as removing any protected areas that wouldn't be eligible for enrollment in a conservation center program. We then identify 2 different types of vegetation data layers that we use to inform the vegetation in this simulation. The first one, both of them come from Landfire. The first one's the existing vegetation cover, which allows us to identify row crops, the percent of forest, the percent of shrub, the percent of herbaceous or grassland across the landscape. And then using the existing vegetation type data layer from Landfire, we're able to specifically identify the different forest landscapes. So we're using upland forest only in the simulation because that's what we would be realistically enrolled in these programs for bobwhites. We recognize that different types of agricultural lands could be enrolled, but because these have different financial incentives associated with them, such as enrollment rates, we're only focusing on forest systems for this simulation. And so we identify our forestry stands using that combination of existing vegetation cover and existing vegetation type to create a subset of different forest stands. But the stands themselves are identified using the Rook's rule to see where the adjacency is. And so we're starting out with different pixels that are forestry and then identifying which ones we can actually combine into stands based on how close they are together on this landscape. And so once we have our forestry stands across the landscape, we have to break them up according to these property boundaries to result in the unique landowner forestry stands across a given landscape. And we applied 2 different constraints once we've identified these unique forestry stands. The first one is a size constraint, where we have to make sure that every single stand is at least 0.4 hectares or greater in order to be considered for enrollment. Otherwise, if it was smaller, realistically, it wouldn't be enrolled in a conservation incentive program. We also have to consider that not all private landowners are going to want to enroll all their stands in our program. And so while multiple private landowners could enroll, one private landowner could enroll multiple stands in our uncenter program, they might not want to enroll all their stands on the landscape in the program. And so we removed 10% of these stands just before our simulation starts to recognize that constraint. And so once we've identified all our different land cover and what exactly our forestry stands that we can enroll in our program would be, we can then go through and identify the baseline habitat quality for a given landscape. And so to start with, our row crops, all of these classes are actually coming off of the existing vegetation cover data set. And so we're basically converting these pixels that identified the different percent cover into habitat quality. So for row crops, this value of 0.55 is on the probability scale, which is going from 0 to 1. It's work that was done by a previous postdoc in James's lab, Victoria Newman, on a habitat suitability study. So that's the kind of blanket value we're using for row crops. For forestry, we're using this simple linear relationship between the percent forest cover and the habitat suitability. Again, that's the scale going from 0 to 1. Where quail are doing better when there's just less dense forest, which is where this line is coming from, just kind of a simple linear relationship there. For our shrub and herbaceous categories, we had a bit more information to work with that was done by a previous PhD student in James's lab, John Yiser, who did an expert elicitation survey across the entire bobwhite landscape or habitat range. And so this is information that was given to us by experts. We've subsetted it to only include the suitability for the state of Georgia. And then we've just fit a spleen regression to try and identify the overarching relationship between the percent cover of shrub and habitat suitability, again from that 0 to 1 scale, and then the percent cover of herbaceous or the grass layer, also from a 0 to 1 scale. So once we have our habitat quality map done, we can then go ahead and identify different conservation practices. So we've identified 3 different conservation practices across the landscape that could be applied for quail, specifically in upland forestry stands. So we have burning or prescribed fire, brush management, which is kind of a thinning out of the understory. And then forest stand improvement is actually a combination of 2 different practices, thinning of forestry stands as well as burning. And so we have the prices associated with each of these. These are coming from the Georgia Bobwhite Quail 2020 records. And the probability at which these stands are randomly assigned across the landscape is based on equip data. And so there's different probabilities the stands the practices are being applied to a stand. But we recognize that there's stochasticity here that we have to deal with, where we could just have a really bad assignment of conservation practices that would result in kind of faulty results. And so to try and guard against this, we've ended up doing 10 different random distributions of practices across each of these forestry stands. And so there are actually 10 different landscapes of just replicated forestry, of replicated conservation practices. And we keep these consistent across all 3 frameworks. And so for a single sample landscape, there are these 10 different replications of actions, and we're holding those constant across each of the frameworks to make sure we have a realistic comparison. Once we have identified those different conservation practices, we then have to identify how there's a change in habitat quality from that baseline forest relationship, and then what happens to that relationship once you actually go ahead and apply the practices. And so that red line is the same relationship between the percent forest on the x-axis and that habitat suitability from 0 to 1 on the probability scale on the y-axis. And so that relationship is consistent across all 3 graphs. And the burning and brush management, we applied a piecewise function to just try and shift that relationship to the right, specifically where the forest was thinner. So it's a simple linear relationship that would describe what we think would happen if you apply burning and brush management, and we actually use the same relationship for both these practices. In forest stand improvement, we recognize that this practice should be more efficient for quail, and so we have a different piecewise function that's taking into account the fact that you're both burning and thinning a forest stand to get a shift in the baseline habitat quality for quail forest stands. Okay, and so all of the past items I talked about in the simulation will stay the same across all the frameworks. And I'm now going to talk about how each of the different frameworks differ in how they're making their selection. So to start off with, I'll be giving a conceptual overview of the 3 different frameworks and then talking about the changes I'm making to the kind of overarching methods in the simulation itself. So the ranking framework is pretty straightforward. We've identified those specific landowner forestry stands, and then we're just going to randomly select them. There's not much information going into the system here. We're just kind of picking them at random, and then we're seeing what the changes in the abundance of quail. And so the overall view here isn't changing. We're using the exact same information, using our selection to apply the selected conservation practices, which will result in changes to the habitat quality, which will give us our final abundance. For the ranking framework, this is slightly different. We're taking into account different attributes in the ranking framework, such as location, the land use, and the different conservation practices. And then there are points associated with each of these that will result in specific points, basically associated with those forestry stands. We're then going to pick the forestry stands that have the highest point values, actually implement the conservation practices with the selected stands to see what change is happening to that base habitat quality map, and then run that through the population model. And so we're adding 3 different data layers here, in addition to the base ones that we have, and then going through the exact same process as the random framework, where we're making changes to that habitat quality based on the selected stands and their associated conservation practices, and then seeing what the resulting abundance is. And so the 3 different layers that we're adding are mainly related to the location. This is all based on the Georgia BQI 2015 ranking framework, which has 3 different metrics that it's scoring the different private landowners on. The first one is location, so I'll be starting with that one, and then land use and the conservation practice. So location is based out of 200 points. It's the most heavily weighted attribute in this ranking and scoring method. And there's 2 different metrics of location. The first one is from the Georgia BQI specific maps. And so there are 2 different point values coming here from the different regions that the state's identified as important. They have these focal areas as well as focal landscapes that they attribute points to, where they're really trying to have a high density of different conservation practices for quail in these areas. The second attribute of that, the second sub-attribute of that location metric is coming from the biologist ranking index. This is a statewide conservation project that was done to identify, at least at a course level, the biologist ranking for quail across the state and these high, medium, and low levels. And for the areas that we're looking at, they're mainly medium and high. And again, it's at a fairly coarse level. So for most of our landscapes, we have pretty much the same level of biologist rank. So these are both being put together into that location attribute. For land use, there were 6 different land use categories that have been identified in the Georgia BQI ranking framework. There's bottomland hardwood, exotic grass production, open canopy pine with native ground cover, pine stands with sparse native ground cover, row crops, and upland hardwood. And the points here are identified based on what percentage of a private landowner's boundary is in which land use. And so inside a property boundary, we have our different forestry stands, but these are just ranked based on what's happening around them, not necessarily stand specific. And so if you have the entire property is just filled with pine stands with sparse native ground cover, and it's from 70 to 100% of that property, it's going to get a really high point value here. And then the points kind of descend from that category. And so we were putting together these categories using, again, the land fire existing vegetation cover and existing vegetation type data sets. And then that final objective metric is the practices, which were the practices that we're randomly distributing across the landscape. And there are different points associated with the forest and improvement, prescribed fire and brush management practices. And so what this ends up looking like is for each stand, you have points for location, points for practices, and points for land use. And you add up all those different points to get your total, and then you're selecting the stands that have the highest values in that kind of total column. For our purposes, we were just ranking these, so kind of reordering that total column to show which stands have the highest number of points. and then selecting until we hit our constraint. So how much of the landscape we were actually enrolling was specific to that landscape cap constraint. And so we were just kind of ordering these points and then enrolling up until a certain point of the landscape had been selected. And so moving on to the model-based approach, in this approach, we have all the different forest stands on the landscape already identified. And we're using a binary here where a stand is either included or excluded in a final solution. And then we're using a genetic algorithm to assess the different abundance return from each of the different possible stands and selecting the final stand that returns the highest number of quail. So what this looks like inside the genetic algorithm is that we're starting with a whole bunch of different possible combinations of stands. And so this is called the starting population. That's different from a biological population. The whole premise of a genetic algorithm is kind of based on your high school biology genetics. And so you have this population of possible solutions for the sample here, where we've got 3 different visualizations, but in our actual algorithm, we're using a population of 40. For each of these different possible solutions, you're going through and assessing how well they do. So you're taking each solution, running it through a fitness function where you're assessing what area of the landscape that solution is covering, seeing if it violates that constraint of how much of the landscape you can actually enroll. And then you're going through making the changes, assuming that the constraint isn't violated, you're making those changes with the associated conservation practices, making the changes to the habitat quality, and then running it through the population model. And so there's kind of a whole iterative process that's happening here for each of these different potential solutions that you're evaluating with the population model before you've actually made your final selection. So you have the starting population, you're running each of these different starting solutions through that fitness function. And then you have a whole bunch of different changes you can make to that population. Again, each solution is just a binary string of whether or not a forest stand is included or excluded in your potential solution. And so in our selection step here, we can go through and use a tournament selection to see which of the different potential solutions are doing really well, which of them are returning the highest number of birds. And then we can do single point crossover. So if you remember from high school biology, if you have a chromosome and they're exchanging information, they're doing that crossover. So the same thing is happening with these binary strings. They're going through and doing crossovers to try and mix up the number of stands in each solution and try and explore different possible solutions. And then you also have random mutations. So the main takeaway here is we're basically just finding ways to create new solutions in these 3 steps. And then we're starting over with a new potential population, potential starting populations, running through that fitness assessment again, checking to see what the total abundance is, finding new solutions. And we're running through this iterative process about 30 times until we reach some stopping criteria where our result will just be whichever of the solutions was kept in the genetic algorithm and is giving us the highest abundance of birds. And so that's what I'm trying to demonstrate here. We're using the same information to start with, but then in our selection criteria, we have this iterative process where we can sample subsets of potential unique forestry private land in the stands, and then test them to see what the return is in terms of abundance on that given landscape. And then our final landscape is the one that genetic algorithm is choosing as its kind of optimal solution. Or, in the genetic algorithm, it could be a near optimal solution. It doesn't necessarily have to be the best of the best. And then making those changes across the habitat quality map before getting our final abundance estimate for that comparison. And so I've mentioned this population model that's really embedded in the genetic algorithm and that we're using to make these comparisons across different frameworks in terms of abundance. And I'd like to walk through now how that operates. So we're starting out with a set number of years. So in our case, we're setting this population model to run for 10 years. And then we're randomly assigning coveys across the landscape. And we have a starting value of, I think, 25 coveys in our small landscape and 50 coveys in our larger landscape. And the location of these coveys is going to depend on winter survival as well as habitat effect. We're then going to include more winter survival into the kind of subpopulation from our starting value of breeding adults. That's going to be impacted by density dependence. And These adults are then going to disperse in the spring. The dispersal is based on the habitat effect and the mating attraction, which will result in the breeding population. There's going to be a certain amount of productivity, and of those chicks, a certain amount are going to survive. That results in the post-hatch adults and chick population, which are then going to disperse, again, based on habitat and the distance between different coveys, to result in a total population of young in the year and adults before coveys break up and start the whole process all over again. And so there are a number of different parameters embedded in this model. For our purposes, any of the different randomly generated numbers have been held consistent in the population model. And so we're using the same parameters for dispersal, productivity, survival, across all the different population model runs that we're doing. And I'd like to take a minute and talk about the habitat effect that's being used in this model. So a previous PhD student of James's, John Yiser, did this study that was published in Conservation Biology in 2021, where he was looking at multiple different species, but the main one for our purposes here is that this tan shape here, which is for the Northern Bobwhite. And what they were looking at was the impact of habitat, not only at a certain point for an individual, but also around it. And so for the Northern Bobwhite, it's impacted not only at the value of the habitat quality at a single raster location, but it's actually impacted by habitat up to 8 kilometers around it. And so the population model is actually taking that habitat effect, this kind of 8 kilometer buffer, if you will, around a single individual into account when it's going through and doing different migration or different movement processes across that landscape. And so I'd now like to talk about the results. So to start off with, this is kind of a visual overview of our different results. We have our frameworks going across the rows, and then across the columns, those are the different landscape constraints. And so we can see starting off at 5%, there's not very much of the landscape enrolled across any of these frameworks, but it's kind of building as it continues from left to right. And then over on the right-hand side here, we are showing you the selected parcels outlined in that dark color green. The light color green are all the different possible forestry pixels on a landscape. And so the dark ones that are outlined are just the outlines of the selected stands. And just to, I guess, clarify, in the 20 and 25%, it does look like a lot of the random and ranking frameworks are selecting quite a bit more habitat than the model-based framework. But if you actually zoom in and look at this at a deeper level, there's a lot of space in between the different selected parcels. And so at least at the 25%, the total population is actually higher in that model-based framework than the ranking and ranking frameworks. And I'm happy to talk about that more later. But for now, I'd like to transition into the final results and talk about how this model-based framework is actually doing really well across the board. And so just to outline what we have here, we have our model-based approaches as these circles, and then the random framework is a triangle, and the ranking framework is a square. So we have the 3 different frameworks outlined by the different pixel shapes, and then the landscape sizes. That small landscape is going to be the lighter blue, and the large landscape is the darker blue. And so if you look across the board here, it looks like the model-based framework is doing really well in all the different simulations we run. So we have our 5% of the landscape constraint, 10% of the landscape constraint, 15, 20, 25. And then our total bird abundance is on the y-axis, and our cost, the amount of money we're actually spending to implement these conservation practices, is on the x-axis. And so, yeah, across the board, the model-based framework is doing really well. I've highlighted the ones that are statistically significant, where those error bars aren't overlapping. And it's basically in all of the lower landscape constraint frameworks, and then for the larger landscape, also in the 20%. And those error bars are the standard error bars for each framework. We have those 20 different sample landscapes. And then we also had 10 different replicas of actions across each of the sample landscapes. So each point is 200 different observations. And then, yeah, we've just taken the standard error of those. And so that's what we're seeing kind of broadly here, is that the model-based framework is doing a lot better than the random and ranking framework. And so looking at the random and ranking framework, you can't actually see much of a difference between the two of these, at least in how they're comparing. And so this is for the abundance, that population metric. In terms of costs, if you're looking at the difference between, you have this vertical difference as well as the horizontal difference. So the vertical difference, that's significant, are the ones that I've highlighted. In terms of the horizontal difference in cost, we're not seeing much difference in the smaller percentages between the model-based framework and then the random and ranking frameworks. But as you get into these larger percentages, there is quite a difference between the model-based framework in terms of how much it's spending, as well as the random and ranking frameworks. Again, the population here might not be super different, but the cost itself is quite a difference between the amount you're spending on the frameworks themselves, which brings me to my next point about Pareto efficiency. So if we're thinking about how we want to have a framework operate when we're making these decisions about who to select and who to enroll in a conservation practice, we really want the options that are going to minimize our cost and maximize our bird abundance, which is putting us in like the top left-hand corner of each of these plots. And we're seeing that's pretty much exactly where the model-based framework is. And so moving on to the efficiencies now, where for each sample landscape, we've taken the total amount of money that we're spending on that landscape and divided it by the total bird abundance, accounting for the fact that we're spending this money over the course of 10 years. We have on our y-axis the cumulative birds created over a 10-year period per $1,000 spent. And then on our x-axis, this is just the different amount of land enrolled. So this is another way to show the 5 to 25 landscape constraints, just converting that percentage into hectares. And what we're seeing here again is this really efficient model-based approach. So we have all our circles coming across the top here, where you're getting your most bang for buck in the top left-hand corner, and then still doing pretty well across the board with those model-based approaches, regardless of how much land you're actually enrolling. Our ranking and random frameworks are across the bottom here. We're not seeing much difference between those. And one thing I'd like to draw your attention to here is the fact that we do have some rows where there's overlap between the smaller and larger landscapes. So in cases where we have the light blue and dark blue frameworks overlapping, this is because the smaller landscape is exactly 1/2 of the larger landscape. Or another way to say this is the small landscape is, the large landscape is double the smaller landscape. And so you have certain areas of the simulation that we've set up where you're enrolling the same amount of land under different frameworks, but we can compare those two different landscapes. And so 5% of the larger landscape is the same as 10% of the smaller landscape. That's the comparison we're seeing in this left-hand box. And then 10% of the larger landscape is the same as 20% of the small landscape, which is the comparison seen in this red box on the right-hand side. And so we're seeing if you can make these comparisons, but we're not seeing much of a difference between them. And so there is kind of this overlap between the different landscape sizes when you're enrolling the exact same amount of land, which, as I said, the landscape size has implications for the efficiency of a program, because you're having to select between a whole bunch more different private landowners. As that landscape gets larger, you just have more options to select. But we're really not seeing much of a difference between the landscape sizes and the implication and the impact that would have on the approach. So to move on to the discussion, my key finding here was that the random and ranking enrollment strategies perform really poorly compared to a model-based approach. And there are a couple of reasons potentially for that. The model-based approach, the status quo approach of ranking and scoring applicants is really a greedy approach where you have your different potential stands to enroll across the landscape, and then you're ordering them based on which ones you think would be most important. And then the greediness is coming that you have this order and you're selecting as many parcels as you can until you hit that landscape constraint. And I think that's why we're seeing the big difference and the larger percentages of the landscape with the budget, because you have a really greedy approach that's maximizing out the budget every single time. And the impacts that we're seeing or the efficiencies in the 5% of the landscape constraint where it's really efficient in the smaller landscape or at the 5 and 10%, for both the smaller and the larger landscape, are highly supported in the research on landscape connectivity and habitat saturation. So essentially, when we have less land that we can actually enroll in a landscape, the location and configuration of that landscape is really important for the population. And then at larger levels of the landscape, when you're enrolling more of it, you already have a lot of good habitat across the landscape already. And so the location of the habitat that you're adding isn't as important at these larger percentages of enrollments. So we made a couple of assumptions and limitations, and have to recognize a couple of limitations of our simulation here. To start off with, we didn't have a buffer across our landscapes. And recognizing that we were using that scale of effect, that 8-kilometer habitat effect for bobwhites, it would have been really nice to have a landscape that had that 8-kilometer buffer around it. We did try and do this initially, but due to computational constraints, we were unable to continue this analysis. Essentially, the genetic algorithm is currently taking anywhere from 12 to 24 hours to run with our current landscape sizes. But then when you include that buffer, it just gets so big, it doesn't run in a reasonable time. And you can't actually make a decision for the different learners to select, at least not to complete your master's degree on time. And so there are a couple of computational constraints that I was working within, and using this high computed cluster, this kind of computationally intensive way of selecting different applicants. We also recognized we had a couple of assumptions about habitat quality. We have a pretty simple linear relationship between the percent of forest cover and the habitat suitability, as well as what the impact would be on habitat quality when we go ahead and apply those conservation practices. And then finally, for the different private landowners, we were assuming that if you're taking all the private landowners in a given landscape that have forestry, or specifically upland forest stands on their landscape, that you could go through and the majority of them would be interested in enrolling in the Conservation Center program. We did have that 10% reduction, but it's likely that there could be less interest than the amount that we took away already. There's also issues there with people actually going through being enrolled in a Conservation Center program and then not completing the conservation practices they were assigned to do. This is called partial controllability. And we didn't take this into account in our simulation. We were assuming that as soon as that conservation practice was applied, that the private landowners would be actually going through and applying the conservation practice to their land, which might have implications for the effectiveness of all of the approaches, but specifically that model-based approach that really does rely on being able to choose which patches of habitat are aggregated closely together. But the other benefits of the model-based approach is that you can kind of take this into consideration. And so there would be a way to apply the concept of partial controllability inside the model-based approach and test it to see how well it can perform with partial controllability included. So you can actually go through and address different types of uncertainties. We made this assumption that you already had a pre-existing list of private landowners interested in being enrolled in a conservation incentive program, and we were randomly assigning the different conservation practices to those private landowners. But if you wanted to, with this model-based approach, you could go through and assign the optimal conservation practice the landowner should be applying to their field. So this would be maybe a little bit tricky to code, but it's definitely something that could be done under the model-based approach to try and identify what the optimal practice would be for a specific private landowner. And so there's ways you can use this model-based approach to address uncertainty and also change it depending on the parameters you're trying to address in a conservation incentive program. So future research could be, kind of changing the model-based approach and including different types of parameters or different types of system. We could change that landscape constraint to a budget constraint. We can also go through and use this model-based approach to monitor and update our decision-making. So we were assuming for the sake of this research that it was a one-time decision run over the course of 10 years. If you're making this decision on a yearly basis, you might have to adjust that population model to account for a 1-year time period and include a dynamic decision. But you can also go through and, after you've made that decision, actually see, well, what's happening on the landscape, what's happening with my habitat quality when I apply prescribed fire to a forest stand, and then use that information the next year when you're making your next decision including the new information you've gathered across the landscape. And so I do want to circle back briefly and talk about this $500 million that's coming to conservation incentive programs. I think it's really exciting that we have this much money that's going to be put towards conservation for wildlife. And while it's not clear right now how much of that money is going to go towards Northern Bobwhite, we are talking about a very large sum of money. And the Bobwhites also have, as I said, already pre-existing conservation incentive programs that are doing this type of landowner enrollment already. And I think what my research is trying to highlight is that there are different ways of making decisions on who to enroll in a conservation incentive program. And I'm hoping that if you take away one thing from this presentation, is that there is a lot of efficacy in using a model-based approach to make your decisions. And that can be done using a structured decision-making framework, as I've done here. So I'm happy to talk more about this. If anyone's watching this presentation recorded or has questions afterwards, please feel free to follow up with me on that. But for now, I'd like to take a minute and say some thank yous. So I'd like to thank the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources for funding my research. I've been on a Warnell assistantship over the last 2 years. I'd like to thank James and the Game Lab for funding my current assistantship this fall. Also a big thank you to the Game Lab as well as the Georgia Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit for funding my travel to conferences. Thank you to the Georgia Department of Natural Resources for being willing to share information about how the Bobwhite Quail Initiative was run. That was really informative to have a pre-existing conservation incentive program that I could work with instead of pulling numbers from different places. So thanks so much for sharing those resources with me. Big thank you to all the folks at the Georgia Advanced Computing Resource Center for helping me learn how to use the high computing cluster. And then thank you to my mentors from Cornell and Resources for the Future for giving me the background to do this research, as well as to all my friends and family for supporting me and letting me talk about structured decision-making at all times. So with that, thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Annabelle. Do we have questions for Annabelle?
Probably easy if you put them in the chat and then we can repeat them to Annabelle. We got a lot of people on the call, which is great. That might be a record. At one point, there were 57 participants, which definitely the most when you don't offer free pizza or beer. So that's
yeah,
impressive. So, thank y'all for coming. If you have questions, just put them in the chat and hopefully folks are typing questions.
Heather, does the model assume that the conservation practices are implemented immediately, like in year one?
Yeah, it does. So yeah, we're using basically a 10-year population model that's assuming those conservation practices get implemented in year one. That's right.
And that's the same assumption for all three frameworks, correct?
Yeah.
You got a compliment from an iPhone. That's great.
The iPhones are smart these days,
Yeah. Gwen asked, great presentation, Annabelle. I was impressed with the cost efficiency of the model. You didn't actually incorporate cost as a constraint. So how is that working?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I had the different costs associated with each of the conservation practices from the Georgia 2020 BQI framework. And I was going through within each of the different simulations and seeing, okay, well, based on the different conservation practices that were selected, what was the cost associated with each of those? And so the cost was done based on a per hectare basis. And so I could back calculate cost by saying how big a given forest stand was and what conservation practice was assigned to it. And then calculating the cost for that forest stand, as well as all the other forest stands that have been selected. So for a given simulation, I could get the total abundance was coming from that population model. And then the cost was just a back calculation I was doing based on the Georgia BQI values I had for each of the conservation practices.
Diana asked, how long was the model assuming that the individual properties were enrolled in the in programs? So what was the assumption about how long the properties were enrolled?
Yes, that's also a good question. I think that there's an assumption that it's at least, I guess there's two different things happening here. There's the length of enrollment in a program, and then there's the length that the conservation practices will be kept up. And so we were making an assumption that those conservation practices would be maintaining that kind of optimal level of habitat quality across the 10-year period. And so as soon as the conservation practices were applied, they were being applied year one, and then the habitat quality was remaining at that kind of high level across all 10 years. And so I think that was an assumption that could then result in two different possibilities for private landowners. The individuals could either be continuously enrolled in a conservation incentive program across those 10 years. But there's also some of the literature that shows that as soon as you have conservation incentive, so you have landowners enrolled in a conservation incentive program, even if they're only enrolled for 1 year, they might continue doing the conservation practices for kind of some foreseeable future. And so there's a return on investment there where you're paying someone to do a conservation practice for a given annual cycle, but then you're actually getting benefit from it going forward. So to actually address your question, I guess there's two different possibilities there for the assumptions baked into the individual properties. I think a more realistic assumption would be that they, do these conservation practices, you get that bump in habitat quality, and then over time it gradually decreases.
Jeff asked, is there a commitment from the state of Georgia and FSA to adopt a model-based approach instead of the traditional ranking process for enrollment in CRP?
Not that I know of, but I would be super happy to talk to anyone from the state of Georgia about how that could be implemented.
Dallas asks, how do you think selection would change if the area already had large areas of quality habitat?
I think that's where the model-based approach would do really well, because it could identify where the large areas of quality habitat already are on the landscape, and then selectively choose landowners probably close to, if not directly bordering on, those large areas of quail habitat. So there would be, I guess, a connectivity benefit that's really embedded in that population model that would allow the selection to do really well under the model-based framework, as well as possibly under the ranking and scoring framework could have that embedded in it if the point system was recognizing where those large area of quail habitat already are. And I think that's sort of embedded in the Georgia BQI model now. I'm assuming this is Dallas Ingram asking the question. So there is kind of some information already included in the ranking and scoring framework for Georgia currently. Yeah, it would be interesting to see what would happen if I was removing those protected areas from consideration. I'd be interested to see if you were including those to see what would change. So that's I guess my speculation. But yeah, feel free to ask the follow-up if I didn't answer that sufficiently.
Just to add, I mean, if the area is really large, like 50% of the 6,500 acre area or something like that, or the 13,000 acre area, then I think any one of the approaches will be similar, because as you saw, as the percentage of the landscape goes up, the difference between the framework starts to diminish. So if the area is really big that you're talking about, Dallas, then probably any of the frameworks would suffice. But yeah, that would be my guess.
Are there any more questions? If you have a burning question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it now. We have a question from Dan. How does the model adjust for the landowner adoption of the management program?
So it's currently based on a yearly decision making, and so currently, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're asking about, well, if you go ahead and enroll a landowner, what happens the next cycle? And I think right now the program is just based on an annual selection, but it's not a dynamic decision. So we're only making the selection once. And so I think that would be the next step of the research to see what happens. Well, if you're having to make a dynamic or linked decision where you're enrolling people on an annual basis and you continue making that enrollment decision, what would happen? Like this. Okay, I see.
You're talking about the FU parameter.
Yes. That's a good one. Yeah, so that's I think where the model-based program has the ability to include this information. I don't know what would happen with the random and ranking framework. I think across the board there would probably be a decrease in efficiency where you would be, investing money in these conservation incentives, in these conservation practices that aren't being done. And so there would be a decrease in efficiency across the board, assuming they're not being done, at the same rate in all three different frameworks. But then as soon as you, I think, have a really high degree of landowners not actually implementing the conservation practices that say they're going to implement, then I think that's when you start to see a decrease in the efficiency of the model-based system, because you don't have that same, you're making an assumption that you're going to be implementing all of the different conservation practices with that model-based system when you're making the selection in the first place. But then if you don't have that, then you're losing the connectivity that's embedded in the population model you're using to make a decision. But I also think that you could maybe include that in the genetic algorithm and say, well, which of our decisions are the most robust here? If we're anticipating that a certain percentage of landowners are going to be saying either yes to being enrolled or actually, and then in reality not implementing those conservation practices, the model-based system could probably incorporate some kind of like a set random number that removes different private landowners each time it runs. But then you could see which of the solutions are going to be the most robust to private landowners saying they'll enroll in a program, but they're not actually. I guess that's what I'm thinking would work. But yeah, I'd be interested to see how that would actually play out in practice.
Right now, you're assuming 10% of the landowners won't actually play ball. Is that?
Yeah, so that's before we actually go through and make our enrollment selection. So I guess we have like two different scenarios here. There's the before you make your decision, kind of having that knowledge ahead of time, which private landowners are going to say no to you. And then I think there's the implications after you've made your decisions about who to enroll, which private landowners are either going to say no or sign up and then not do the conservation practices.
These are great questions, folks. I'm sure Annabelle would be glad to follow up with any of this via email. And that we plan to post this online at some point, and I'm sure she'll be presenting this at TWS, correct?
Yep.
And those of you in the quail community, you'll probably continue to hear me harp on stuff like this, so won't be able to escape it.
Yeah, and a big thank you to Adweed, who built the population model. I see that she's on here. So that's been awesome to get to work with such a cool project already.
Well, thank you everybody for attending and giving Annabelle your attention and for your great questions. I think at this point we will dismiss everyone but Annabelle and the committee. So please catch up with Annabelle later if you have other questions or just want to wish her congratulations.